You're listening to ARC. Hi there. Quite a few new listeners are coming to the ARC channel, which we are truly grateful for. But if you are one of those, maybe even a first-time listener, this episode will not make sense on its own. And we'd hate to disappoint you. So before you listen further, please go back and start listening from episode 1 of the Unburied series, right here in this feed. Okay, back to the story. Today's ARC interview is with Professor of Anthropology at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, Stephen Robbins. Stephen, we are sitting here. Is this your office?
Yes.
Yeah. It's full of books and papers and the kind of thing you imagine a researcher would have. In his career, Stephen has researched a lot of things, including identity, land and land reform amongst the Nama and the San, or the Bushmen of South Africa, the same people Rudolf Puck traveled amongst just over 100 years ago.
In particular, the reclaiming of Nama identity and San identity in the context of land struggles.
But that's not actually why I wanted to speak to Stephen. Not entirely, at least. Because Stephen Robbins' family wasn't always the Robbins family. They used to be called Robinski and were Jewish immigrants to South Africa fleeing from persecution in Nazi Germany. But only some made it out before it was too late. A tragic story that Stephen knew almost nothing about for most of his life.
One moment that catalyzed the idea that I needed to know more about my family was when I was attending and writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And I would hear the families of activists who were murdered by the security police saying, "We want to know what happened, we want to know where the bodies are." And at that same time, I started to want to know what happened to my family. I mean, I knew they'd been murdered during the Holocaust, and there was a photograph in the living room that I grew up in Gqeberha, Port Elizabeth. And there they were, these three women whose names I didn't even know. I knew nothing about them.
Hearing the stories of people who knew nothing about what had happened to their murdered relatives during apartheid sent Stephen down a road that eventually led him to write a book called Letters of Stone. And I randomly picked up this book while finishing up Unburied Season 1. And reading the book helped me connect some of the dots between the Kalahari, the Nazis, apartheid, and even a lot of the conflicts that are happening in the world today. So this ARC interview with Stephen Robbins is really about connecting the dots between the different kinds of thinking that can lead to genocidal violence, but also about how sometimes being a victim can end up paving the way to becoming a perpetrator.
You know, this is a tragedy for me. I see this playing out in contemporary Israel-Palestine, but I refuse to accept that as the logical conclusion of the story of what happened. There are other lessons that should be learned, one of which is never let this happen to anyone, anywhere.
Here's my interview with Stephen Robbins, who begins by explaining how, soon after his work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he visited the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C., and began a long journey of connecting the dots between his own life and the history of so many others. My name is Rasmus Bitsch.
I started speaking with a librarian, and I mentioned that my family had been murdered in the Holocaust. And he asked, well, what was their name? And I said, Rubinski. And he went and got this big black book from the shelves. It's called the Berliner Gedenkbuch. And it had all the names of the victims of the genocide. And then he went to the R's and eventually got to Rubinski. And in a way, that was a key moment for me, because this quite abstract idea of the Holocaust took on more of a personal reality for me, because then I had their names, their birth dates, where they were born, where they lived in Berlin. So I had addresses, and I went to these places later. And so a slow unfolding process began on that day, I would say.
Mm. And when you mention that, it's quite interesting considering the topic of the Unburied podcast, right? Because a lot of that is about the ancestors we don't know anything about, and what we have been hearing from a lot of community members is that is a huge part of the issue in and of itself, that there's some kind of, for many, it's like a deeply spiritual issue, but for you can maybe understand this need. Like, can you talk about the personal need of like finding out? What does it do to you not knowing?
And the question for me is, when do you have that need? When does it surface? At what stage in your life? So as a kid growing up in Gqeberha, I knew about this in an abstract way because I went to a Jewish primary school where we were taught about the Holocaust, but was taught in a way that in retrospect I see as quite depersonalized, because it was linked to the making of the state of Israel. So it was linked to an ethno-nationalism rather than being a very personal thing. Right. So for me, the process was deeply personal. It wasn't about Israel. It wasn't about the Jewish people. It was about these family members, my father's parents and his siblings who were murdered in Auschwitz and Riga. And I began to want to know who they were and what they went through, or just anything I could get hold of. So starting from zero, knowing very little, a photograph in the home I grew up with. So this image of three women, not knowing their names. I mean, I didn't even know my grandmother's name or my two aunts. And I knew they'd been murdered, but I knew nothing else about them. So it was a very kind of detached or distanced knowledge. Getting the information at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and then having the drive to want to know more. And that's, I think, the question. When do you want to know? What do you want to know? And so I wanted to have a sense who they were, for whatever reason. One always can ask, well, were the ancestors pulling me in? Was it my own agency? Why hadn't I asked my father about it when he was alive? By the 1990s, he'd already passed away. And his brother as well. So the only two who survived, who got out of Nazi Germany in the 30s, the two brothers, they were no longer alive. So they couldn't tell me what happened to their parents and siblings.
And they never spoke about it?
Well, they spoke, but in a way that had loud silences. So, and I didn't ask the questions. I didn't ask you, tell me more about what actually happened to your sisters. Why didn't they get out? I never asked that. So it's a big question. Why didn't he tell me more? Could it be because he didn't want to burden his children with that past? Was he also feeling guilty because he tried his utmost to get his family out? And South Africa and the rest of the world shut their doors. They weren't interested in refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees in particular, without money, without resources. And this, of course, resonates with the world we live in now. But the question about what drives you to want to know more and how it comes in bits and pieces is also something I thought of when I was working on San and Nama identity and land struggles, where people, particularly in Namaqualand, where I did a bit of research, many people were Afrikaans speaking, they had been Christianized, they had a very fragmented attachment to their their missionaries had come there in the 1800s, and there'd been They've been dispossessed of land, language, and a whole range of other things. So how were they going to get in touch with that past? And I had a similar experience because there were tiny fragments.
Yeah.
And, what do you do with fragments? And in a way, my whole story is about working with fragments. You get a little bit of information. And it's over 2 decades, the information starts accumulating until much later I get this mysterious package of 100 letters, which had been sitting in my aunt's apartment in Sea Point. And when she passed away, her kids had come across this. And these 100 letters were the key to understanding who these people were, who my grandmother was.
We'll return to the letters after a short but necessary ad break, which you can completely avoid by becoming an archangel and supporting our work, in which case you wouldn't be hearing this at all. Follow the link in the show notes. And now, back to my interview with Professor Stephen Robbins. Those letters, when a lot of them are in your book, and it's extremely powerful because I think when you read it, you sit there knowing what's going to happen, right? And they don't know, right? They are going about their lives. They're trying their best to get out, but they don't know the urgency of it, right? They, even whether they can or cannot do anything about it, we know where the story ends, and it's very painful, right, to read. And so, but as you're saying, the same way of going into the archives to find out about what happened with the San or the Bushmen or the Nama and any of the others are not there. And that's been a lot of the struggle of us making this story, is that the information is not there because also as Nama elder actually told me last week, he calls it, what happened wasn't to them just a genocide, it was a cultural genocide. The knowledge systems were almost destroyed, and for many they were destroyed. So to actually reconstruct anything becomes very difficult. But what I actually want to get into perhaps is the story of how your own family in a strange way gets connected to the Kalahari at a similar time as when Rudolf Pöch went there. But can you maybe just tell me about your uncle? Because it evolves a little bit around your uncle that was the first member of your family that came to South Africa?
Yes. So my uncle Eugene, or Eugen Rybinski, came to South Africa in the 1880s. He was a bit of a fugitive from Prussia. There are many versions of the story about why he had to leave, and family members each seem to have their own version. Whatever the case may be, he arrived in the 1880s, towards the end of the 1880s, and he made his way from Cape Town and to Williston in the Karoo, not the Kalahari. Mm-hmm. But
We'll get to the Kalahari.
We'll get to the Kalahari. So he starts off as a smos, or, a trader, small-time itinerant trader moving from town to town, but quickly sets up a business and soon becomes a hotel owner. He buys a sheep farm and eventually becomes the mayor of Williston.
And Williston, I mean, I've been there quite recently.
Yeah.
It is this quite typical Karoo town, very far from anywhere else, lots of sheep. I mean, I personally love it there. I love the drives. I love those like long distances to open horizons. It's not everyone's cup of tea, I don't think, but for me, I love being there. But Williston at that time, he was there as a Jewish merchant and became the mayor in the years leading up to apartheid, where we know that there was a lot of prejudice also against Jews. Can you set that context? Because that seems a bit contradictory.
Yes, I mean, it's a bit before the Nationalist Party came to power. There may have been some degree of prejudice. We know in Cape Town there was. People didn't want these East European Jews coming to Cape Town. They spoke Yiddish. They looked very different. They were often poor and so forth. But he was able to quite quickly move into the colonial social order and establish himself as a businessman. And there didn't seem to be that many obstacles in his way, it appears. But what I got interested in was a story that somebody, the local historian, Elsa van Skalkwyk, told me. She said that there'd been Williston or Mandelboom busters living in Williston under the protection of the Rhenish Missionary Society.
And can we just talk about who are busters? Who were they?
Yeah, they were mixed-race people. I suppose that would be the way in which they would describe it, with indigenous Nama and European ancestry. And they were essentially pastoralists, semi-nomadic pastoralists, but some had settled in that area of what was then a Mandelboom. And they had quite large herds, and quite quickly they came into competition with the white Afrikaner trekboers.
Who were living a similar lifestyle.
Yes, they weren't that different, but quite quickly the competition created tensions, and the competition was over water and grazing. So these water points, these springs, and so forth. And at the same time, you had the emergence of sheep, commercial sheep farming, and private property. And all of that came together in ways that resulted in the dispossession of the busters, who were pushed out of that area in the 1860s and around that period. And they took what was the real Groot trek across the Karoo, the Kalahari, into Namibia. And they eventually settled at a place called Rehoboth, which is about 70 kilometers south of Windhoek. And they are a big settlement now, the Rehoboth Busters. That's the term they use to describe themselves still. And they were visited by this racial scientist, this eugenics scientist, and he arrived in around 1908, just after the Nama and Herero genocide, and his name was Dr. Eugen Fischer, not to be confused with my uncle, Eugen Rubinski. And he started doing measurements and, doing anthropometric studies of the Rehoboth busters to find out what were the implications of mixed race populations. It was a topic in this branch of anthropology called eugenics at that time, which later became a form of lethal science. It was used and instrumentalized in the Nazi genocide to show that Jews, Roma, and Sinti, in other words, Gypsies, they were all of an inferior race. They were racially distinct, and this science was able to measure and classify them, and that almost led down this pathway to the concentration camps and the death camps.
And this anthropologist who came to study the busters in German Southwest Africa at the time, Namibia, what happened to him later? He became prominent.
Yes, yeah. So he, 1908, he did his, I think it was a postdoctoral study. He published this ethnography on the Rehoboth busters in I think it was 1912. It was internationally recognized, and numerous other very powerful philanthropic institutions were funding the science. And they were funding Eugen Fischer at his institute in Berlin called the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity. And Fischer had been recognized by Hitler already in 1923 when Hitler read his work in prison in Munich after he was involved in a putsch, and he was imprisoned for a while. He came across Fischer's book and was very interested in the racial science ideas in that book. And he writes about it in Mein Kampf, his book that he wrote. I think he started in prison. So 1933, Hitler comes to power. He appoints him as the chancellor of the university in Berlin. And by then, he's already the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology. And the major racial science during the Nazi era of the Third Reich happens at that institute. So
this is like the scientific backbone of what happens.
Yeah. So it's, they're producing the science that supports the racial classification systems and the denigration of the inferior races, Jews, Roma, Sinti, and so forth. What also happens is that Mengele, the notorious Nazi doctor and scientist, was a research associate of the institute in Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and he was sending blood samples and eye specimens from the concentration camps of Roma and Sinti and Jews and so forth. So the institute was totally implicated.
This is how the things weave together, right? And becomes fascinating to think about. But I also remember from your book that your uncle ends up buying some of those properties that the bastards leave behind when they are forced out.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, it's a curiosity. It's not really important for the story as such, right? But I think it just kind of goes to show that these same people ends up then being forced from there, where he, as a Jewish man, is actually prosperous. They then become studied, and that study ends up forming what is the knowledge that is used to justify the murder of his family members later in Germany, right? Or in Poland in that case, like.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, they're quite uncanny aspects to the story and what happens to people and how these histories collide and intersect in all sorts of ways. So the history of colonialism ends up being intimately connected to the history of the Nazi genocide. One of the lessons for me of the book, and I had a sense of it quite early on in the process, that if you are open, you are able to see connections. So it's not just a history of Jewish victims of the Nazi genocide. It's a history that intersects with other histories of colonialism, violence, dispossession, and so forth.
And when you talk about it in that way, that kind of openness, like, how does that affect the way that you've looked at Southern African history? Have you ever drawn those parallels also in your work with San and Nama between your own history and theirs?
No, absolutely. I mean, at one level, I think there are many levels in which that's happened, but at one level, I got some idea of what it means to try and tell a story about oneself and one's family when you only have fragments. So that's where I started with silence. My father hadn't spoken much. I'd written an essay in a book at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was called Silence in My Father's House. It was about the tiny fragments I'd managed to get of what happened to the family. And this was written at the time of attempts in the 90s to reclaim land and identity in Namaqualand and the Sandland claim in the Kalahari as well. And I had this idea of the demands that are placed on people, particularly indigenous groups, where they've got to prove their cultural continuity.
Yeah.
So let's say you go to court, whether it's a Native American land claim or in the African context, and you've got to say, well, we are the direct descendants of these people who experience this colonial violence and dispossession. But precisely because of the dispossession, the loss of language, of land, of culture, of identity, you only have fragments. That's all you've got, are a few words in Yiddish or in San or in Nama, and you've got to somehow produce this coherent story. And in the courtroom, the question will be, but are you really connected to those people?
And you're up against the state's archive, right? The archive that has told the story, because that's one of our episodes talks about how it's the anthropologist, in that case, Rudolf Perch. He is the only real archive to what happened, and everyone else has been silenced in that. Not that they necessarily were silent when it happened, right? But their histories are erased or not preserved anywhere. So when they have to prove what does, their rights to a place, for example, they have to deal with the fragments. And I mean, I remember reading something about the land claim where some women were talking about how they remembered that they had, as children, buried something like beneath a certain tree in the Kalahari, like decades and decades ago. And that became evidence because people actually went out and found it, right? And that's very, very difficult work to prove your own, identity, essentially, right?
It really is. I mean, in the case of the Holocaust or the Nazi genocide, what you have is a massive infrastructure of museums, of archives, of history books, of novels, of films, etc., etc. So it is quite a big archive at a certain level. At the personal level, it may be different. Some people may have been told by their parents or their grandparents what happened, etc., others not. But when it comes to the Nama and the San, it is much more difficult. Where are the archives? And what has been transmitted over time? And how do you deal with silences and gaps and inconsistencies? What I questioned in one of the essays I wrote on Nama and San land claims and cultural identity claims is often people are called upon to produce these coherent narratives of cultural continuity, saying we are the same people, we are the direct descendants, etc. But in actual fact, the inconsistencies, the gaps, the silences, and so forth are in fact a direct reflection of the historical experience that their ancestors went through. It was shattering. It produced fragments. That's the truth of the matter. And to expect people to somehow have all the information, the archive, the narrative, coherent narratives actually is unrealistic, precisely because of the shattering encounters they experienced through missionization, through land dispossession, losing the language, and now only speaking Afrikaans, really. So it's a question of, you can tell the story in many different ways, but we're often forced to create these coherent accounts of ourselves. When in actual fact, the story is about silences and loss and fragments.
And one of the aspects here, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's this German scholar, Annette Hoffmann, who's written a book about Perch, actually, and his sound recordings. And she talks about echoes. That's like her thing, right? And she talks about listening for the things that were not necessarily intended to be on the record, and then looking them up, and we include some of those in the podcast, and also played it to some activists from the Kalahari, where, imperfect as they are, because the language might not be understood anymore, for example, they felt, okay, this is one of those fragments that, I mean, makes, like, has a deep kind of, creates a deep connection. Can you like relate to that in terms of finding fragments of your own?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, that I do recall that, because I have come across Annette's work before. I'm familiar with it, it's really interesting. Things that weren't meant to be, part of the interview or the transcript make their way into the conversation as a way of talking back.
Yeah, exactly.
To the powerful anthropologist and subverting his story.
I guess maybe the example of that and of the silences is in those letters that your family members wrote. You often kind of speculate on whether or not they are telling the full story, and if not, like, are they censoring themselves because of the censors, or are they trying not to worry, their relatives in spite of the dire circumstances they are in? Like, reading between the lines is, I guess, a similar experience.
Yeah, I wrote quite a bit about that, because I immersed myself very deeply in those letters. I read them over and over again. And I got that strong sense that I had to learn how to read between and beyond the lines. And some of the letters were written in a kind of code. You could only say certain things. So there are certain lines, such as your uncle has gone away for a few weeks. And I worked out later, actually, he was in a concentration camp in Sachsenhausen, just outside of Berlin. And there are many other, examples of that where, and as you say, at times she was trying to protect her sons from knowing how vulnerable they were and the family were, and then at the same time trying to convey urgency that they should try and get Edith, the daughter, out, and it should, that things were getting really dire, very serious in Berlin by the late 1930s.
I remember my first history professor saying, like, history is actually not really a study about the past. It's a study. It's a struggle over the past in order to define the present. That's the point of it. And in that way, for me, that became like the question of why is it important to talk about the past? And I feel like when doing a story like this, which essentially is a niche story about a relatively small population in outskirts of Africa, but it teaches me, or it has taught me, a lot about what the world looks like now, and how, history and these kind of thoughts keep popping up. Like, we should not really, it feels like it shouldn't be necessary to talk about how eugenics and all these thoughts are completely wrong and debunked and all of that. And yet these are conversations that live on the internet today. There are people who call themselves serious researchers who believe this stuff today, right? But also how it plays out in politics and in how we feel about each other. And I mean, I don't know, do you have any reflections on a long career of studying this stuff, on like, how do you see the world now? Do you find these thoughts as well as being around?
Yeah, I work on many other issues, but this one still does intrigue me. I recall listening to a short video of speeches of Trump, where he constantly refers to genes, and he's referring to white people, and he's saying, oh, that family has good genes. And it's in numerous of his speeches, over the past 5 to 10 years. And it's not racial science in the strict sense, but it's working with the language of racial difference and genetics. And that's definitely alive and available. And as you say, there are groupings that more self-consciously draw on these legacies of racial science thinking. But then there are other ways of thinking about nationalism that also have within them a kind of racialized understanding of our people.
Our people, like
yes.
Whoever we are. That's,
yeah. You know, this is a tragedy for me. I see this playing out in contemporary Israel, Palestine, where racialized ideas of difference are leading to genocidal violence. So this isn't by any stretch over, even though the science seems to have been discredited a long time ago.
And do you think that these ideas, I mean, we talk about violence, right? But are the ideas themselves necessary? I mean, you talk about what came first, you know, is it the Holocaust or is it the race science or, you know, are they dangerous? Like ideas like these, do they lead to violence? Maybe not inevitably, but can they lead to genocide and violence?
Yeah, under certain circumstances, definitely. You know, these ideas are available. They may not be used, but they're available if people have those political desires to instrumentalize these ideas. So they're floating around because there seems to be something commonsensical about racial difference, which is highly problematic because the science says, well, there's no such thing as a race.
Yeah,
really. You
biologically, it doesn't exist.
It's a social construction, etc. Groups have far more difference within them than between them and other groups. So that already UNESCO came out with a statement along those lines, you know, after World War II. But yet, these ideas are still very popular, and populism is very popular at this historical moment. As I say, we can see those ideas being unleashed in Israel through ethno-nationalism, which is another form. It's not straightforward racial science. It's how do we think about the legacies of those ideas? They may not look the same now, but they're strands of continuity. Our group is fundamentally different from them. You may use the cover of culture, but underlying you're implying there's a racialized biological basis for the difference.
I mean, this is a complicated area, and you know, I don't want to say too much that I get wrong, right? But when you're looking at the rising nationalism in South Africa, also within the so-called colored community, where many identities are connected to the histories that we're talking about, right? Where there is this like reclaiming, but also sometimes that falls into the xenophobia, and it speaks to, I think as well, how, you know, how similar to Israel that you're putting up, that having been a victim does not mean you're not going to be a perpetrator later on. Like
exactly. I mean, Mahmoud Mondani wrote a book a long time ago about how victims become perpetrators, and it was quite prescient.
So how do you avoid that?
Try and avoid ethno-nationalism for a start. I think, yeah, it's highly problematic to build a form of ethno-nationalism, a hard form of ethno-nationalism, where you deploy histories of collective suffering. And I wrote about that already in 1998 in that essay, Silence in My Father's House. And I referred to both, you know, the story of how the Boer concentration camps created the conditions for a very strident and ultimately very racialized form of ethnic nationalism called Afrikaner nationalism.
So the suffering of the Afrikaners during that war ends up...
And there was very real suffering. But the way it got translated into this very strident racial exclusivism of national party ideology is not that similar to what's happened with Zionism. Zionism does draw on constantly the history of genocide of Jewish people. That was real. That happened to my family. But I refuse to accept that as the logical conclusion of the story of what happened. There are other lessons that should be learned, one of which is never let this happen to anyone, anywhere.
No, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thanks for your book as well.
No, thank you very much, and thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this ARC interview. We're completely dependent on you, our listeners, to keep making documentary series and having interviews like the one you just heard. And we'd love to hear what you have to say about them. You can write to me directly on rasmus@arcdocs.org. In the show notes of this episode, you can find a link to become part of the backbone of the ARC community by joining the ARC Angels. This gives you ad-free listening and bonus content. But the main thing you're doing is enabling us to keep making more and better stories. So if you can, please consider joining us. This episode was made by me, Rasmus Bitsch, and Liddell. If you liked it, please share it with the people you like.